Ha! That's right. A little media scrum. Took me 9 years to get one of these,
Well, John, kind of knowing now what we know about your first visit here based on the documentary, what was your temperature coming in this time? I mean, were there any nerves, were there any thoughts going through your head about what's going to happen this time around?
Well, when I came here for UFC 253 in September, knowing that these tests, for whatever reason, didn't agree with my body, yeah, I think there was a little trepidation and a little anxiety. It was very interesting to see the way it all played out on Declassified and to see sort of some of the reenactments and dramatization. But some of those moments were very real. And if you know our live production structure and the way these shows get put together, you know we voice a lot of stuff in advance. The preparation starts weeks before the pay-per-view. So I'm not trying to put out the rest of the broadcast team. It's a big deal if our lead play-by-play guy is not available for a pay-per-view in a show of that magnitude. So it was less than ideal. I've never heard my boss, Craig Borsari, so excited when he called me and told me my next test was negative, and I turned around a couple more negatives, and here we are, and so far so good this week. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely some emotions that come back when they're sticking that thing down my throat, for sure.
So I know the big concern was obviously your own health, and then obviously you mentioned not being able to see your kids and that sort of thing.
Right.
But as a professional, how much of it was just like, oh no, they're not taking this fight away from me?
Yeah, I mean, certainly you want to work the big shows, and I'm coming up on 9 years with the company this month and almost 50 straight pay-per-views. So, yeah, you want to work the big shows. I mean, that's really what it's all about. But I cut my teeth, as you know, with you, boots on the ground across Brazil for years and years, learning, the secondary fighters and the bottom half of this roster, for lack of a better way to put it. So I think it was really just thinking about John Gooden and my backup at the time and all that was going to be put on his plate. I mean, dude, I'm literally in my room typing John Gooden's name in my fucking scripts. Like, literally, hi, I'm John Gooden, welcome to UFC, whatever it was. So it was real for a while. But, yeah, I was thankful to be able to call a fight and a card of that magnitude. And I think the thing that was really sticking with me was, man, I'm going up to the 5th floor for a 14-day mandatory medical quarantine, and then I got to somehow turn around some negative tests to get home to my kids. So it was anxiety-filled for sure, but, I think these things harden you and really just make you mentally tougher. I could use all the mental toughness I could get, John.
Sorry, so let's talk about this one. Another big fight. Obviously, everything's about the main event. I mean, it's a good card, but everything's about the main event. I know you're into the stories of these things as much as anybody. So what's most enticing you about this? Is it this, this guy in Khabib who's like going towards this incredible record that nobody's ever had before, or is it this guy in Justin Gaethje who seems like perhaps just the right amount of crazy and the right amount of skill to get this done? Which one is kind of speaking to you more?
Gosh, that's a tough question, right? I am born and raised in the United States of America, so when Gaethje starts screaming USA, I would be lying if I said those moments don't give me chills, but I think it would be disingenuous for me to sit up here and not tell you that this is very much about Khabib Nurmagomedov, and the backdrop of his father is a really powerful thing. And, he is not irritated with repetitive questioning necessarily, but in our fighter meeting yesterday, a little bit, skosh, but in our fighter meeting yesterday, I wanted to figure out a creative way to sort of attack that father angle in a sensitive, respectful way. And so I asked him if he had ever had any conversations with his father about Justin Gaethje as a possible future opponent. And Abdulmanap and Khabib would always look at the landscape of the lightweight division, and there would either be guys that they would earmark for Islam Makhachev to fight or guys that they would earmark for Khabib to fight. So Gaethje was on their radar, but more often than not as an opponent for Islam Makhachev. But I will say about Justin Gaethje, if you had to pick one fighter in this lightweight division who is best equipped to beat Khabib, to save a dog's life, I think most of you would pick Justin Gaethje with respect to Tony Ferguson and the rest. Maybe Tony's a little more content hanging out off of bottom. I think in terms of the defensive wrestling, even though he hasn't had an opportunity to showcase it greatly, I think he is the guy best equipped to escape from underneath this, lightweight / light heavyweight. The big question is, does Khabib feel like a light heavyweight to Gaethje like he did to Poirier? And I think we'll get those questions probably pretty quickly on Saturday.
Last one for me, and I know you like to break down fights and that sort of thing, so I want to ask you about the environment itself, too, because we saw against Dustin Poirier that it felt like he kind of broke, right? But you remember that venue. It was full of people that were all very much cheering, for Khabib. It was also hot as hell in there, you know what I mean? So it was like, It felt like a real pressure cooker. Inside the Apex, it's almost cold. There's no fans, or inside I should say,
right.
Flash Forum. It's almost, it's cold. So Is this a better environment, I wonder, for Justin Gaethje? Do you think that's a factor at all in this fight?
I think to dismiss any of this stuff as a factor is pretty ignorant, right? You're absolutely right. This is the coldest broadcast environment I've ever called fights in. So for us, it's a dream. We feel like there's a hockey rink below us. But there have been some fighters who have absolutely excelled in this climate and others who have not. Imagine being Dominic Cruz. You haven't competed in 4 years, and you're walking out to an arena, and you can literally hear a pin drop. There's nothing ideal about that. So I do think that the crowd lifts up certain fighters, and that whole backdrop resonates with some fighters and not with others. Look at the way Jan Blachowicz was able to compete in this type of setting. You know, he's sort of the crowning example for me of a guy who really sort of maximized this opportunity despite all of the different variables that we're dealing with. So I think that people are maybe leaning too much into how great Gaethje was against Ferguson just because he could hear every word out of Trevor's mouth. But I think these are the two best lightweights in the world, and I don't expect that the crowd or lack thereof to be a big factor Saturday.
Going off that, obviously everyone wants to see the fans back in the world get back to normal, but do you think there's something to be said that maybe we should at least appreciate this period in time with no fans, because it doesn't take away from the sport in my opinion, but it does add a different aspect to it? Do you think maybe we should actually enjoy the fact that for a while we're seeing high level fights with silence?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good way to look at it. I think we all in general in life should probably be leaning more into the positive than the negative. I get asked oftentimes about not having a crowd as an announcer, and certainly when I go back and watch film and I hear some of these championship calls without that accompanying crowd response, it does sound a little bit anticlimactic. Certainly from a play-by-play man standpoint, when we got the cans on in a tunnel, we're not worried about any of that. And no one will be happier than me when the crowd is back, because I do feed off of it, especially when I'm doing that pay-per-view open, the whole Dateline Abu Dhabi bit. It's really nice to have the crowd behind me, although it's hard to compete with sometimes. But yeah, I do think that there is something very intoxicating about this whole atmosphere in Abu Dhabi, this W Hotel, walking into a largely empty arena to call sporting events of this magnitude. It's very weird, it's very intoxicating, and I do think that we should lean probably more into the appreciation than complaining about the lack of fans.
Is it remarkable then, without fans, that certain fights can still have that big fight feel? You know, when you see Masvidal and Usman standing there, you see Izzy and Costa standing there, and I can't imagine anything other than when you see Khabib and Gaethje standing there, you
Right.
still get the butterflies, right? It's not that the crowd's there, it's the electric in the air, it's the two fighters themselves. Is there something to be said that this sport is so magnetizing, regardless of the presentation?
Absolutely. I think for American sports fans who are so aligned with their NFL teams, or European fans with soccer, football, whatever it is, you know, when your team is about to play a big game, you are anxious, right? You do not have a great appetite necessarily. Maybe you're drinking, right? But you do not want to eat a bunch of food when your team is about to be in a big game. And for me, when these athletes are set to compete, I'm not nervous as a broadcaster. It's not performance anxiety. It's the UFC fan in me that is thinking, holy piss, this fight's about to happen. Like, one of these guys is about to win and one of these guys is about to lose. So I've said it on broadcast a million times. I should probably change up the language, but there is nothing as tense as the start of a UFC title fight in a UFC main event. And I don't think if there were 20 people in the building versus 200, as we'll have here on Saturday, that would change for me.
The last thing for me, it feels a little bit like Khabib and Gaethje is coming at a moment in time. You know, there's no crowds, it's the end of fight and all that stuff. Just as a personal fan, like you just said, what does this fight mean to you, and what does it mean right now in the way the world is and the pandemic and all that shit?
Well, it's amazing to think how much we have done in terms of cranking these fights out. You know, I think back to April when I was wrapping my head around going to Lemoore, California to call fights in a climate that didn't seem all that safe, and had some anxiety at that time. And now I look, man, we've been ripping shows every single weekend and largely not missing a beat. You know, it's easy for me as a guy who gets his cut check by the company to sit up here and wax poetic about the executives and all the great things that they have done. But there's a lot of play-by-play guys that aren't working, and if they are, they're calling sporting events from their living room. So I'm very thankful to still be working, to still have my boots on the ground. And as far as the magnitude of this main event, you know, Khabib's legacy is essentially, a lot of it's rooted in being undefeated, and as such, he puts it on the line every time he competes, and that is tremendous pressure. If any athlete is mentally tough enough to rise above it, it is him. He's been largely immune to pressure, but I do think that this matchup, it'll either bring out the best in him, or he'll finally meet his match, and thankfully, we'll find out in about 48 hours. Thank you.
So, I want to ask you a bit about your career, it is not easy to follow a beloved and iconic duo like Rogan and Goldberg. But over the years, I think there's no question you are the go-to play-by-play announcer for the big events. Can you just talk about having that evolution and, just growing into the role of being the number one guy in the broadcast?
Well, thanks, and I appreciate you saying that. I'll try to answer this as honestly and as efficiently as I can. I spent 6 years at ESPN in Bristol, Connecticut. I never would have left there if I didn't think I could eventually ascend to being the number one guy for the UFC. That was my goal when I joined the company in 2011. I didn't pull Goldie aside and tell him that was my goal, but I thought that I could eventually ascend and either work with Joe Rogan or be a part of the A-team, and maybe it happened a little bit quicker than I expected it to. But, I've always sort of leaned into the preparation, and sometimes you get frustrated when people always talk about how hard you work. It's like, yeah, Anik, he just works hard. It's like, well, am I any fucking good, or do I just work hard? And so at times I got sick of everybody saying, he just works hard, And so finally when I got elevated, said, all right, well, maybe there is some skill there that's allowing me to take this next step. But again, Joe Rogan is an icon, and to sit to his left for these shows is not lost on me. I have a weird clause in my contract whereby they can terminate me without cause at any time. So when I tell you that I got to earn that seat every show, not unlike a fighter, that's the truth. And I treat it that way. I got to go earn that seat for UFC 255 next month. And that approach hasn't failed me yet. A lot of people think the way I handwrite my fighter cards is antiquated. That hasn't failed me yet. But I'm really trying to, as much as I don't want to always keep my mouth shut, keep my head down, and, just focus on the magnitude of these shows, because honestly, this is nothing like calling a college football game. These shows are just such beasts every time we do them. The amount of hours of prep, 7.5 hours on a headset, and I think if I don't have my head in the proper place, there are plenty of guys who want to come take my job, hundreds of them. So we'll see if they can do it.
Was there a particular point or just instance where you kind of turned that corner? Obviously, you're on the broadcast, you're calling the fights for the smaller shows, and was there just one that was like, you know what, I've reached that point, I'm ready for them to bump me up at this point?
I don't know if there was a specific fight. Certainly a year into my UFC tenure, I got a call to do UFC 155 in December of 2012 on short notice. So I think I got a call on Christmas Eve to go over to the audio guy's house and revoice the whole show. And so I think that kind of being thrown to the wolves helped me when eventually I ascended to pay-per-view, because I had done one. But I just think the volume of shows, from the minute they hired me, I was doing half the shows. I was actually doing more shows, than any play-by-play guy from the moment I got hired. So those repetitions were hugely helpful. When I go back and listen to some of my early calls, bro, I cringe, I think my voice was a full octave higher at that point. I've had a lot of voice damage over the years from video games and other things, but I don't know that there was any specific moment, but certainly my confidence has grown, and I wasn't nearly as confident, when I did Bellator Season 1 in 2009. I remember walking to the arena like, dude, they got the wrong guy, man. Like, I'm a stick and ball guy. What am I doing here? But thankfully, repetitions and age, give you the confidence to do the job you're entrusted with.
Final one from me. I know you were also a broadcast teacher, if I'm not mistaken, before UFC and
Right.
everything took off. Now you have students who are saying, I want to end up sitting next to Anik on the show. What's your advice to those young broadcasters coming up now?
I do appreciate that, and I think my foremost passion is probably teaching, or I guess probably gambling, but a close second to gambling would be teaching. There's so many little bits of advice, but the number one thing I always say, and it may sound trite, but you have to be ready at all times. So translation, if you're listening to this, start a podcast tomorrow, start a blog tomorrow, because you don't know when your opportunity is going to come. And if you're not ready, it's not going to happen. I remember going to ESPN Radio in Bristol, Connecticut in 2005 for an interview. And all of a sudden I had to do an audition, and the schmo knows this, live on the radio, right? Literally, they send me in to do a national sports radio update at 4:20 p.m. Eastern. And if you're not ready, like, that ain't happening. So I didn't think I was ready, but you go bang out a 75-second update, and you're ready enough, and you get the job, and you move on. So that was the biggest learning lesson for me, singularly in my broadcast career. Thank God I was ready enough to do a national sports update that day, because if I wasn't, I never would have broken that ESPN door down, and I certainly wouldn't be here talking to you guys.
Speaking of gambling, you said Gaethje has the best tools to be the one to erase the O from Khabib. He's plus 270, I think, at MGM. Khabib minus 340. Do you agree with those?
I think the fight is properly priced. You know, when somebody says Justin Gaethje is a live underdog at plus 270, what they are telling you is that it's improperly priced in some way, shape, or form, that he's a live underdog at that number and he should probably be closer to plus 180. If you look at the odds history of guys like Kamaru Usman and Khabib Nurmagomedov, Khabib hasn't always gotten that Kamaru type respect where he's minus 850 against these guys. But without having a blueprint for beating Khabib Nurmagomedov, which we don't have, I do believe he deserves to be entrenched at minus 340. I don't know how you can race to the window necessarily unless your bankroll's a lot fatter than mine to lay that price. But I do think at this point in time it's properly priced. And we did see when Khabib fought Dustin Poirier that Khabib closed an even bigger favorite than he opened. So I'm most interested to see if any Gaethje money comes in and if Justin, ends up lower than plus 270 or so.
And we've talked with DC a few times in this fight, and obviously he's not just teammates with Khabib, but like he considers one of his closest friends, and he compares it to when he calls draw and win matches.
Right.
If he loses, he needs a minute, and he lets you guys take over. Have you had that conversation with DC at all about like how this might play? Like, because Khabib might lose.
Yeah.
He might need that moment.
Yes, we talked about it yesterday, and obviously it's just me and DC in a two-man booth, so I will be there to rescue him in those moments. And I do think the Duran win comparison that he brings up is appropriate in some part, but you're also talking about Duran Win being 1 or 2 fights into his UFC career versus a title fight involving a guy who's trying to go to 29-0. So I do think that the emotions will be heightened for DC. Not that he's closer with Khabib than Duran necessarily, but just because of the magnitude of this fight. But this is something that we have all had to deal with, whether it's me calling Daniel's fights or Paul's fights or Dom's fights. And certainly for the teammates, it's a very tricky thing. But I know Dominic Cruz, when he's had to call Jeremy Stevens' fight, he is really able to separate church and state. He is really able to focus on the fight, be objective, and then, dry his tears if need be. But I know it's weighing a little bit heavily on Daniel. He has never called a Khabib fight before, as you guys know, and I'm always there. I mean, that's the thing. I'm not the professional athlete in this broadcast equation, right? So I'm the guy who's there to sort of make those guys shine, make those guys look good, and help them out if they have a tough moment. And hopefully for DC's sake, that's not his fate this weekend. We'll see. Okay. Cool. Thank you all.
Thanks, man.
Appreciate it.